Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm gonna share my screen. I have prepared a little bit of just a 10 pager, really, really quick. Is my screen still sharing? Can you guys see it moving?
Yes.
Okay, amazing. Cool. So we are Insomnia. I'm the CEO and co-founder, and today we'll be talking about user-centric token design. So I know a lot of the cohort has gone through, a stakeholder session, right, where you guys were learning about, what type of stakeholder journeys, bootstrapping network effects, understanding when to do that and the different life cycles of what that looks like. And primarily, if you guys are learning about all of those things and there are, sinks and faucets, as well as other sessions coming up. Today, I probably primarily want to focus on token design as it pertains to stakeholder and how to think about stakeholder value accrual based on kind of the token projects that I have personally done, as well as the things that Insomnia has done for our clients. And so just to kind of give you guys a little bit of context, we are a product studio. We work very heavily with L1s and institutions to develop blockchain solutions. And L1s could really range from really small ones to really big ones, primarily thinking about helping them go to market, launch a token, find product market fit, as well as do a lot of the technical development of those projects. For me personally, I've designed a ton of protocols. My claim to fame is helping with the tokenomics of the graph very early on in 2018. So a lot of the thinking today might mirror some of the things like that. I did have a chance to take a look at a lot of the different decks that you guys have provided on the portfolio side, which I thought was very interesting in terms of how many projects there are in terms of bootstrapping different type of marketplaces, as well as different types of protocols. So I would probably focus a lot on especially two-sided marketplaces, which I think a lot of different token networks are, and going into kind of how to evaluate who your stakeholders are, and having your token designs revolving around something like that. So primarily, I think to kick things off, understanding and identifying where your stakeholder value really comes from falls in these three large buckets. Personas, which if you guys are here, you guys are great founders. You're really thinking about. Oh yeah, Matt, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, real quick, Billy. I don't know if your slides are moving.
Yeah, it's not on my side.
Yeah,
That is
just
very tragic.
no worries.
One second. What about now?
Yes, they're moving now. Awesome.
Okay, awesome. You just missed my face, which is nothing to be. We can skip over that really quickly. And so where I left off was, understanding and identifying stakeholder value falls in three buckets, at least the way that we think about it traditionally. And so really thinking about stakeholders are all the participants within your ecosystem, right? To dive a little bit deeper, that's really understanding the personas, where their needs are coming from, what really drives their day-to-day activity within your network, and then on the second part, thinking about how are they getting outsized value, right? Where are the value accrual happening? And that is really important because the value accrual is where the token needs to be. And that is where the token interactions will need to be. And as your network grows and scales, that is where you would want your token value to be able to capture that value so that your token grows and scales. Lastly, I think something I think very deeply about is although there are a lot of token projects out there that are giving away a ton of tokens from a community standpoint, really understanding how much you're trading off in terms of engagement for effective long-term value slippage, right? The more tokens that you're giving out on the onset from a bootstrapping perspective, the more that users will probably flock to your network. But then you also then have tremendous downward pressure in the long run. And so making sure that you're balancing that, having your token price really reflect the value that your business is going to provide, right? And your token project is going to provide is really, really important. So just to kind of give a example of designing something like a stakeholder map, right? So we use kind of a P2P decentralized GPU computing network as an example because it is the craze right now. Something your stakeholder map would look something like buyers and sellers, right? You're a two-sided marketplace, and you have different personas. And to really dive deep into each of the personas, you really want to think about the needs, like why are they here? What are they doing today? What are the incumbents? And where are the major value loss that is being created that you are coming in to fill, right? So for buyers, in this persona could be AI developers who need decentralized computing. First, and decentralized computing meaning they do want, let's say more safety on their compute, or they want to pay for existing compute, right? They will pay a premium for data or for credits or for learnings that have already happened on machine learning networks that are hosted by others. And so they could today, let's say, go to Akash or Tensor for decentralized compute. Or they, if they're open to kind of more centralized computing, they can go to OpenAI, right? Or different AI platforms that provide the same thing, like Cloud, Anthropic, et cetera. And the major things that your persona as an AI developer would be suffering from is that if they were to host their own servers or if they were to use existing centralized entities, a lot of it is that you don't really understand what is the actual compute happening behind the scenes, one. Two is that they could be very, very expensive to use, two. And three, you don't really want to be, let's say, hosting your own or, having to run your own servers for a lot of these things, right? Because that comes with high capital expenditure. On the flip side, you have sellers, right? Whose personas are, the data warehouses and the cloud providers, that are actually providing these GPUs from a compute perspective. And their biggest need is that, they're just hosting these clouds. Whatever they're not using is lost revenue, right? And so when you think about like what they're doing today from a seller perspective, you can think about, well, perhaps they're running their own standalone sites. Perhaps they have partnerships with, different networks, different providers who would leverage their distressed inventory whenever there is high demand, right? So they're sharing in one way, shape, or form, but in a centralized manner. But lastly, the thing that they're majorly suffering from is, being able to match to this demand of buyers, right? So if you were designing a P2P network for a decentralized GPU computing, these are effectively the stakeholders that you are solving for, right? You're really thinking about what are all their interactions on your network and where is the value accrual really happening. And so, when we think about the value accrual then in the form of buyer and seller actions, it really comes down to understanding what are the actions that the buyers would need to be taking on your network. We give really simple examples here, such as using tokens to charter compute graphs. So, for example, if you had, tokens and you want, a machine learning network to be spun up, you're paying them for, their GPU space. You are effectively paying them using the native token, right? And this is where one of your token usage could come from. You could also be using these tokens to unify existing intelligent graphs that have already been created, right? So let's say you want to leverage learnings that have happened on a specific domain of knowledge. You want to combine that with, your machine learning models. You would be able to do that, but you would have to spend, right, this actual token. On the seller side, you might say, okay, well, what are they thinking about? In order to, let's say, incentivize them to provide great compute resources, you might have them stake tokens, right? In order to say, have them have great uptime or great accuracy and precision of their data, you might have them stake tokens in order to reflect the amount of intelligence or the amount of compute that they would be ready to serve. So thinking about value accrual in this fashion also allows us to think about and tie them back to exact user actions that they would be having and how your token is positioned to capture that value. To go a little bit further then is to really think about the different roles and functions within this network. And so I would say most L1s have these established roles in one way, shape, or form. There might be different subsets or combination permutations of the same things. But really, we're thinking about consumers, right? Your buyers, your sellers. Sometimes these are oracles or validators. Different people that are, let's say, incentivizing developers, right? People that can build, on your L1s, build on your network, who may or may not be consumers. And then provider and contributors, people that are helping build the efficiencies in your network. And when we go into kind of our examples, we'll show a little bit more on the contributor side. And lastly, there's governance. And, I don't know if we really want to go super deep into the governance rabbit hole today, but, governance does play a big part, in terms of, let's say, protocol upgrades, making sure that everybody understands the fees, right, or the rights to those fees that change over time inside of the networks that you guys are creating. And so a lot of these roles then, could fill out into different functions, right? And, different functions could have span across multiple roles, but these are effective stakeholder functions that we think about when we're designing these networks, things like participation incentives, staking, slashing. When do these things happen? When and why do they need to happen? As well as the general fee circulation from one stakeholder to another. And I think throughout the kind of the course of what you guys will definitely go through within the next couple of weeks, a lot of this will be made more crystal, or some things that you guys have already thought deeply about. But just crystallizing this into more of a framework for you guys and making it simple. It could also be like a checklist, right, that you guys are going through as you're building out your tokenomics. And lastly, with every network that you're trying to build, there is economies of scale, right? And obviously, you guys are here, you guys are building token networks, you know about this. In the context of stakeholders, though, what I really want to kind of call out are incentive alignments when economies of scale is happening. So, are you guys designing for, let's say, early participation equals higher growth value? And what is the slippage on something like that? What is the slope on something like that? And does that at any point start disincentivizing certain actions within your network, right? And so and that is part of the trade-off, say, when you're balancing both short and long-term incentive. On the flip side, you're also thinking about disincentive alignment. So are punishments equal to the value loss, right? So in the situations where, let's say you're building a decentralized compute graph and somebody is not having great uptime or somebody is actively malicious, is the slashing of their fees or the banning of them on the network enough to compensate for the loss of value to your network, right? So designing the token in a way that also captures the downside of the risk is also extremely, extremely important. And lastly, I just kind of want to go through, the exact same process that we just went through, but in the context of the graph. Right? And many of you, I'm sure, already know the graph. When I was designing something like this for them, one of the first things we sat down and we're talking to the team about were all the different roles, right? What are all the different personas that the people have? In what context would they be needing tokens? In what context would they be using tokens or losing tokens, right? All of these things were kind of encapsulated first off by us understanding who the stakeholders are, what their needs are, what did they do, and where their biggest pain points are. And so just to kind of run through some of these things, I would say the biggest things that we also discovered over time was the need for a curator. In the beginning, when we were designing this, we were thinking mostly from a consumer and an indexer perspective, where you would have a consumer that would need to query a blockchain, and you have indexers, which are effective hardware providers, right, or cloud providers that would provide subgraphs for developers to query. Over time, what we realized that there were a lot of people that were also needs to be incentivized to also be curators. And this helped with the precision of the data over time, as well as signaling where the bigger data needs would be, let's say within DeFi markets, with certain DeFi protocols, with certain DeFi projects, and then being able to signal that ahead of time to make sure that there is enough scalability on the indexing side to provide for the queries that would happen. And so there would be times where we are designing protocols and designing these different projects, and new roles would come up, right? And new incentives would need to be created for them. And that's why it's very important very early on to start to map out who all of them are and understand what are the different trade-offs and the different functions that each person or each role would effectively take out. And lastly, the same thing, we're going through the same action. So what are the value actions of the people within the graph network? Well, you have people consuming data, and then they essentially are paying for the data. And a lot of times, these consumers who understand their own demand will curate their own data. And by curating, they are effectively staking the tokens in order to say validate their curation for them and their communities. And on the flip side, you have subgraphs, which are being built out by the indexers and then providing them as queries to the consumers who are paying them in the graph token. And so, this is a super high level rundown of stakeholder alignment, stakeholder overview for designing peer-to-peer protocols. And I wanted to, see if you guys have any questions. But hoping not to waste your time, and hope that was helpful in terms of running through what designing stakeholder incentives could look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. I have a question actually, and this might inspire some others as well. I guess like when you were creating the tokenomics design of the graph, right, of everything you were just mentioning you considered, was there anything where you guys potentially might have gone in a wrong direction, or were there any pitfalls that you guys identified in advance to help you guys be successful, essentially, when you were running that design process?
I think a lot of the issues that we had early on were more towards identifying the how. So we understood, let's say, the stakeholder alignments, but then over time we were thinking about, what the functions would take shape, and then really understanding the trade-offs, and then trying it and simulating the trade-offs again and again, in a contained environment. And that took, I would say, many, many minds in a room debating, arguing about the different type of functions for, let's say, staking, reward mechanisms, slashing, things like that. So I would just say that it wasn't necessarily difficult as much as it is a very, very iterative process, because of what you imagine almost never is what will end up happening.
Hey, Billy, I have a question for you. Um, so one of the things that all of the companies that are participating have been doing, in addition to sort of as a precursor to the stakeholder analysis, is doing a business overview assessment. And one of the questions that we have in there was sort of what are some of your goals specifically for your token? And I'm curious, given with the case study of the graph, right? Like, I'm curious if you have any thoughts or there was discussion around just like what were some of like the goals of just introducing, like why does the graph need a token, or what is the graph protocol looking to gain from having a token when you guys were developing this? And I asked that specifically because the graph being it's an interesting case study because at least from my experience, like when it came about, it was such like an essential tool for building decentralized applications and being able to right like display and query data in a real-time environment in an application because we didn't have right a traditional database for this stuff.
Yep.
So like there was demand for the product. So I think it then becomes okay, well, what's the kind of vision for introducing a token into this ecosystem that could, for something that already had a bit of like PMF, if you will.
Absolutely. Well, I would say that one of the biggest desire was that if you centralize the subgraph network, then effectively, you don't really have decentralized companies, decentralized organizations will not want to work on, right? Because then you're centralizing the data somewhere. And so the vision, even in the very beginning, was to build something that could be decentrally governed, if you will. So that was one of the biggest need for a token. And then over time, that when they effectively started working with me to start thinking through a lot of these issues, what we also realized that it was a very good utility token, right? Very similar to AWS credits, very similar to being able to, let's say, use the token as a metric for how much data is being queried, as well as how good is the data overall on this network. And that's also where we came up with the idea of having curators, because how good the data is really was so important, right? versus, let's say, if you just had consumers and indexers, you're at a situation where you might not have the best aligned incentives when indexers are mostly thinking about providing uptime, but they might not say understand that there might be outsized demand or scalability needs, right? And so that token, let's say consumers can stake a ton of different tokens ahead of time to incentivize indexers to understand that new demand was coming, to then start indexing those subgraphs for their fees, which is then tied to a bonding curve. And so with that, we use tokens to also solve for I would say incentive alignment across the different stakeholders. So I would say governance, incentive alignment, and then overall value accrual within the token became a natural thing.
Gotcha. No, that's awesome, and thanks for that. Um, and not to I don't want to like really deep on the graph, but I think it's a really great case study. I think
Please.
another point that is just a interesting one to kind of unpack is, and this is something that I don't even necessarily have feel like I have a really strong answer for, and it kind of changes company to company, project to project, is making the decision to use your token as that core store of value within the protocol, as opposed to just using like a stable coin. And right, where if let's say so then you're generating revenue from fees from like this paying a stable coin, but like opting in the early days to focus on and prioritize the token in lieu of right fiat, if you will.
Yeah, I think I would say back then there weren't as many
True.
fiat,
That is
great
true.
fiat alternatives. Today, different story, very
Yeah.
different story. I would say there was it was very clear earlier on that they wanted to create their own token system
Yeah.
for kind of the reasons we talked about. Um, and there were actually, pretty high fees as it pertains to using different types of stable coins at the time. We did kind of think about, let's say just using ETH as payment because, we did launch a token on, ERC20 on ETH first for GRT. But what we didn't really think was really good about using ETH in particular was ETH was used for everything else, right? And so whenever to think about signaling demand with these kind of curator oracle system that we had, it didn't serve as a good function for doing so. I would say you also don't necessarily want to lock up right your ETH or lock up your stable coins in the situation for incentive alignment. And we thought
Mhm.
that people would not want to do that, right? Especially because GRT was a lot cheaper to begin with. But if let's say you had to lock up $10,000 worth of ETH in order to run an indexer, that became, a big, it made it hard to bootstrap the network, if you will,
Mhm.
right? You had to incentivize early adopters somehow. And the people that were really running all these, indexers for others wanted some way to do that more cheaply in the beginning.
Gotcha. No, that's a great answer. I think that that kind of touches on what I was sort of thinking, right? It's like the even if let's say the market value like dollar to dollar is the same, there's still a perceived premium on having users expend, let's say like fiat stable coins or ETH or whatever like the native ecosystem token is, as opposed to your own token. Um, and especially when it comes to that idea of like bootstrapping the network,
Exactly.
it's like more psychological than anything.
It's also a marketing tool. And I think you guys go into that from Denarii side. And I saw that and I was like, that's exactly why for where you do want your own system because it is a form of marketing, right? It is a form of marketing. We can't get around that. But it's about how giving out these tokens and having incentives for them to use it, to participate, and then that token value growing over time proportional to your network. That's what's super important about having your own token.
Yeah, hi Billy. Just have one quick question. With Graph, you had this experience of changing certain aspects of the token incentives and what how you're building it, or basically the
Yes.
incentive structure itself. So today, in today's market, do you think that's feasible, or is it a better strategy to delay our token launch till we have our economics in place? Mainly why I'm
Ooh.
asking is why we're seeing is that I mean, over the last 6, 8 months, what we've been seeing is token launches are going, and then you see on Evo how the prices go down. Everyone sells the token, and then the prices go down. It does help with I guess with like exit liquidity, but with respect to finalizing your token design and making a sustainable ecosystem, how do you think that's playing out right now?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Well, I would decouple it because you're building a business, right? You're building an ecosystem. And so, you're not, the first thing is not to think about exit liquidity, even though it's very easy to. But it is important because that plays into the marketing aspect of it. What the graph did, even then, it was, I think, like ICO season, pretty much like right after the when the graph was launched. What we were thinking about is making sure that we had a really strong core group of indexers that had a ton of tokens. And
Right.
those people are very incentivized to hold on to this, and then bootstrapping it in a smaller beta environment. And so the rollout was actually really slow. Like people were able to get the tokens, ride the marketing hype, during ICO season, but they actually already launched it like a year or two before. And the product was live and people had tokens, right? And perhaps some of the token mechanics were changing, but the core group, if they had tokens, even if you're changing how the tokens will be spent, how they would be used, as long as they had it, they had the economic alignment, of making sure that your launch goes well, and making sure, obviously, that them providing the underlying utility makes sense for them. And so I think that comes down to finding the right, business partnerships for you, right, and making sure that they not only bought into the token and the hype that comes with it, but those are the right people, right? They really believe in your products, right? The product that you're building on top of these.
Got it. Got it. Thanks, Billy. Really clear.
Awesome.
Billy, I got a question for you.
What's up?
In today's market, right, with a lot of tokens being launched, I know like some are like some projects delaying TGEs, but with the ones being launched in the current space or throughout this year, were there any that you felt were really strong from like a matching user incentives from an understanding the stakeholders perspective? Were there any out there today that you can speak to? I think that might be cool to share to the group.
That's pretty interesting. I think the most interesting one for me was Ondo. To be honest, I still don't really know what the token does. Like the actual Ondo token itself. I know that what I think they did really, really well was understanding that their market was stablecoin holders and then really getting after that, and providing them, the bearer tokens, right? OUSG, USDY, and the yield. And I think where a lot of companies are going to succeed is if they can really figure out like Web2 partnerships, the Web2 liquidity, and then having that be part of the network, not all of it, to then effectively bridge the liquidity over. And I think that's going to be a really important strategy, not just for RWA in general, but even let's say decentralized compute. I saw one of the portfolio companies doing decentralized RPCs, right? But if enterprises are working on these, they're going to Infura, right, or they're going to Alchemy, and they're using these services and networks. Web2 companies have a ton of dry powder that they're willing to spend, within these ecosystems. You don't really want to preclude them, let's say, from joining your ecosystem and providing that liquidity. I think a lot of the success that I'm seeing now are people who are able to really find the middle ground, but still making sure that the decentralized nature is there and it becomes like a network, of organizations, individuals, kind of all aligning and using one protocol.
I'm curious to like put a bow on things, and everyone like the Insomnia team's gonna like they mentioned they're gonna be around throughout the cohort, so you're gonna have plenty of opportunities to interact with them, um and they'll be hosting some more sessions as we go forward. But I love to hear from you guys, Billy and Matt, like what would you say is one of the most important things to keep in mind when someone's starting the process of building out their tokenomics? Just like a general piece of advice.
My biggest piece of advice is to really think about jurisdiction really early on. We see a lot of our L1 clients run into this where, if you're going to be in the US, um, especially like from a fee capture, right, within your token, very easily becomes kind of a security. I mean, if you're not launching in the US, then a lot of these things don't matter. But I think that's a big gotcha that we're seeing, especially for the big L1s that we're working with big market caps. Like they run into that a lot, I would say. And with any of the token projects here, like it's easy for tokens to go boom, right? And you don't want to be caught on the back foot, of doing something like that. I would say regulatory is kind of a big thing that I probably didn't really mention. The second thing is that, disproportionate value capture with your tokens. So when we're designing tokens, one of the biggest things that, is the math that goes behind it, right? Is really understanding, what the supply mechanics are, understanding what your slashing functions are, the penalties and the reward cycles, and being able to really visualize that and communicate that very simply. I would say those are kind of the two big things that I would start thinking about from the very early on, just so one, you're not, getting caught in the back foot. And then the second is that you're being very intuitive and quantitative with how you're thinking about your reward cycles.
And just to follow on that, I mean, I totally agree with everything Billy was saying. The other piece of the puzzle here that I think is not always looked at very early on is like you need to make sure everything you're designing tokenomics wise, user incentive wise, reward wise, mechanic wise, all ties and is showcased to your community. And you make sure you have that plan to build your community, especially showcasing, say, your product, right? Showcasing the value proposition where your product ties to the tech. But going back to the marketing piece, like time and time again across all the projects we've worked on, stuff comes up, right? Where you might have to delay, you might be missing a piece where you don't want to make an announcement, but having that rollout plan from the beginning, making sure it matches well with everything that you're focused on right now is really important for sure. And especially when it comes to the launch side of things, because there are different stakeholders at play, especially when it comes to making sure you have long-term like financial performance or long-term price performance on your token that you're looking for, it needs to be designed and it needs to be executed from a community building standpoint for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean it's great stuff. I don't know, anyone else, any of the participants have any last questions or thoughts they want to share? I know this is great because this is right in line and reaffirming a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about all week. So it's great to hear it and see it from a different perspective.
And
Appreciate it, Jake.
yeah, no, appreciate it, Jake. Also, like we're here to help you guys too. Like, so I think I'm sure Jake, Kirsten, and entire Denarii slash Redbeard team has explained this already. But when it comes to the Friday office hours, like essentially we just want to help you guys with whatever problem, and we want to learn about your companies in greater detail from you, the founders yourselves, right? And so, however we can help, even if you want more individualized conversations, that's what we're here for. And the office hours are a great way to set that up for us. So thank you, Denarii team too, and thank you to you guys, founders, because we're excited to work with you all or at least help however we can.